In business, there's this idea of a best practice. A best practice is a proven and established process that, if followed, will consistently yield the best possible results. For example, if you want to grow your wealth over time, then making consistent investments in a no-fee index fund, well, that is considered a best practice. Now, I really like the idea of best practices. The promise these systems hold for me, well, they're pretty alluring. The idea is they offer maximum output at minimum input and creating minimum risk, so that's pretty attractive. And then the idea that there's no need to overthink something or reinvent the wheel, that all we need to do is follow these well-established standard practices and you can be fairly assured of a strong outcome. What could possibly be better? What's more, you don't need to be totally innovative or an entrepreneurial genius to get the results you want. Just follow the standard playbook and watch the success flow. Yeah, if it were only that simple. In this video, we're going to explore a whole host of ways that best practices, rather than helping us, may in fact be working against us. This is important because by failing to acknowledge and address these issues, we run the risk of achieving an outcome that is mediocre at best, or worse still, fooling ourselves into thinking that we're doing the best we can when in fact we're only touching the surface of our potential. So, here are the things I want us to consider. As good as it can be. First, consider how best practices can lull us into a sense of complacency. If we're not careful, the idea can cause us to turn off our brains and dull our drive for continuous improvement. If something is considered a best practice, after all, why fret and wring our hands over improving what we're doing when, well, we're just following the playbook and it's the best it can be, right? So let's just move on. Now, some have tried to ameliorate the finality imbued in the idea of a best practice and instead have adopted the term best known method, or BKM. A best known method is essentially the same thing as a best practice, but with one subtle difference. It recognizes that the practice is not immutable, the very best it could possibly be. It's simply the best method we have discovered thus far. It acknowledges that there may be better ways of doing things out there, but until we find these alternatives, this is the best method we currently have. This invites critical examination of the practice and opens it up for future possible improvements. So yeah, continuous improvement is still baked into the idea of a best-known method. Now, I deeply appreciate the message in this slight tweaking of the term, but I question whether it has much of an effect in practice. Whether a best practice or a best-known method, the risk to continuous improvement is often the same. Plug in this method without challenging the logic and move on to other more wicked problems. It's just too easy to do what's always been done in the past and, well, too risky to try something new. This works. Keep doing it. Questionable validity. I also call into question the validity of these best practices in the first place. Just because someone says this is a best-known method or a best practice doesn't necessarily make it so. Maybe it worked for them, but that doesn't mean that it'll work for anyone else, let alone that it is the best possible way of approaching a problem. A practice doesn't exist outside the context of the situation. And while the situation, it varies from project to project. What's more, I contend that we don't always know what practices really led to our success and, well, which ones didn't really factor in all that much. We might think that taking steps A, B, and C made our success possible, but it could be that these factors had very little bearing on the outcome, and that our success was due to something that we're not even calculating. Finally, I believe that many purported best practices get passed around with very little scrutiny, eventually becoming closer to something like an urban legend than a valid practice. And if you don't know where a practice originated, Who's to say that it's a best-known method? Assumes a steady state. A best practice is only the best so long as the conditions in which it operates don't change. And when things haven't changed in a long time, or heaven forbid when they do change and we don't see it, this can lull us into a false sense of security. For example, the practice of just-in-time inventory synced up raw material orders with manufacturers' production schedules for the last 5 decades and was a well-established best practice. Until, that is, the pandemic hit. With no supply on hand, the world completely shut down and manufacturing ground to a halt. Now, these days, companies are using a pack and hold or a just-in-case strategy. This means they overorder parts and materials and so forth to prevent stockouts. In most cases, when it comes to keeping the machinery of industry chugging along, businesses are far more interested in continuity than they are in costs. The point is, best practices, well, they run the risk of making us operationally lazy if we're not keeping an eye on the larger environment. Things have always been this way, they're always going to be this way, we don't need to change a thing, it's a best practice. No. That's problematic. Failing to account for ambiguity. I would argue that best practices are a solid way to get the desired results when the practices are proven, which is to say, they have, reliably delivered optimal results time after time. Now, this is all well and good if you're dealing with known systems and quantities when trying to get a specific result from a common set of challenges. Nothing new. This is all a known system. The example of building wealth over time is a great illustration of this principle because it's the same system over and over. However, best practices can begin to fall flat if we have a less than perfect understanding of the challenges in front of us and are not entirely sure what kind of results we want to achieve in the first place. For example, as a YouTuber, I'm forever asking myself the same questions that every other YouTuber is asking. How long should my videos be? How often should I publish? What is a winning thumbnail design? How do I get more views? And, all that sort of stuff. And like many YouTubers, I scour the internet to learn what others have done so I can apply their best practices to my own craft. Now, there are a plethora of people out there offering what they consider to be best practices, but even if these practices can be considered such, they're best practices for their own channels and their own audience. That doesn't mean they're going to hold equally strong value for me. My goals for Nutshell Brainery are probably different from their goals. My audience is different. My style is different. My everything is different. So where do we get off thinking that a best practice that worked for one person is going to work equally as well for another? Best practices don't invite us to push our craft forward, to innovate, to experiment, to tread new ground and discover new things. Instead, they tell us to stay within the lines and do things the way that everybody else is doing them. In other words, they're not interested in uniqueness and individuality. They're interested in low-risk, consistent, predictable, homogenized results. If we were to reframe best practices as conventional wisdom, then I would offer up this thesis. Conventional wisdom yields conventional results. Now, there's nothing wrong with conventional results if that's your goal. When I'm sitting in an aircraft ready for the pilot to land, you better believe I want conventional results. Now is not the time for experimentation and risk-taking. But for me and my business, conventional results are the last thing I want. All right, so where does that leave me? Best practices and best-known methods play a big part of my life, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Even as I build this weird business, Nutshell Brainery, best practices will play a major role in guiding the more mundane, rote decisions that have to be made. But when it comes to the creative side, I think rather than try to recreate someone else's success by following best-known methods, I'll be throwing a lot more spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. Sure, throwing spaghetti against the wall makes a mess, but great things can come from happy messes. All right, that's all I've got for today. Now go off and make some trouble. We'll see you later.